China detaining millions of Uyghurs. Serious problems with claims by US-backed NGO and far-right researcher, led by God, against Beijing. Claims that China has detained millions of Uyghur Muslims are based largely on two studies. A closer look at these papers reveals US government backing, absurdly shoddy and methodologies, and a capture-ready evangelical researcher named Adrian Zenz. And this is by Ajik Singh and Max Blumenthal. The US House of Representatives passed the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act on December 3rd. Legislation which calls for the Donald Trump administration to impose sanctions against China over allegations that Beijing has detained millions of Muslim-majority Uyghurs in the western region of Xinjiang. To drum up support for the sanctions bill, Western governments and media outlets have portrayed the People's Republic as a human rights violator on par with Nazi Germany. Republican Representative Chris Smith, for instance, denounced the Chinese government for what he called the, quote, mass internment of millions on a scale not seen since the Holocaust, end quote, in, quote, modern-day concentration camps, end quote. The claim that China has detained millions of ethnic Uyghurs in its Xinjiang region is repeated with increasing frequency, but little scrutiny is ever applied. Yet a closer look at the figure and how it was obtained reveals a serious deficiency in data. While this extraordinary claim is treated as unsaleable in the West, it is in fact based on two highly dubious quote-unquote studies. The first, by the US government-backed network of Chinese human rights defenders, formed its estimate by interviewing a grand total of 8 people. The second study relied on flimsy media reports and speculation. It was authored by Adrian Zenz, a far-right fundamentalist Christian who opposes homosexuality and gender equality, supports, quote, scriptural spanking, end quote, of children, and believes he is, quote, led by God, end quote, on a, quote, mission, end quote, against China. As Washington ratchets up pressure on China, Zenz has been lifted out of obscurity and transformed almost overnight into a go-to pundit on Xinjiang. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It has testified before Congress, providing commentary in outlets from the Wall Street Journal to Democracy Now!, and delivering expert quotes in the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Recent, quote, China Cables, end quote, report. His Twitter bio notes that he is, quote, moving across the Atlantic, end quote, from his native Germany. Before Grey Zone editor Max Blumenthal questioned Zenz about his religious mission, in quotes, at a recent event in Xinjiang, inside the US Capitol, he had received almost entirely uncritical promotion from Western media. The network of Chinese human rights defenders, which first popularized the, quote, millions detained, end quote, figure, has also been able to operate without a hint of media scrutiny. The, quote, millions detained, end quote, figure was first popularized by a Washington, D.C.-based NGO that is backed by the US government. The Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders, CHRD. In 2018 report submitted to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, often misrepresented in Western media as a UN-authored report, CHRD, quote, estimated that roughly 1 million members of ethnic Uyghurs have been sent to, quote, re-education, end quote, detention camps, and roughly 2 million have been forced to attend, quote, re-education, end quote, programs in Xinjiang, end quote. According to CHRD, this figure has, quote, based on interviews and limited data, end quote. While CHRD states that it interviewed dozens of ethnic Uyghurs in the course of its study, their enormous estimate was ultimately based on interviews with exactly 8 Uyghur individuals. Based on this absurdly small sample of research subjects in an area whose total population is 20 million, CHRD, quote, extrapolated estimates, end quote, that, quote, at least 10% of the villagers are being detained in re-education detention camps, and 20% are being forced to attend day-evening re-education camps in the villages or townships, totaling 30% in both types of camps, end quote. Applying these estimate rates to the entirety of Xinjiang, CHRD arrived at the figures submitted to the UN, claiming that 1 million ethnic Uyghurs have been detained in, quote, re-education detention camps, end quote, and 2 million more have been, quote, forced to attend day-evening re-education sessions, end quote. Thanks to questionable sources like CHRD, the United States government has accused China of, quote, arbitrarily detaining 800,000 to possibly more than 2 million Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, and other Muslims in internment camps designed to erase religious and ethnic identities, end quote. Testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 2018, State Department official Scott Busby stated that this, quote, is the U.S. government assessment backed by our intelligence community and open source reporting, end quote. The Chinese government has rejected U.S. allegations and claims that it has in fact established, quote, vocational education and training centers to prevent the breeding and spread of terrorism and religious extremism, end quote. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has stated that, quote, there are no so-called, quote, re-education camps, end quote, in Xinjiang at all. The vocational education and training centers legally operated in Xinjiang aim to help a small number of people affected by terrorist and extremist ideologies and equip them with skills so that they can be self-reliant and reintegrate into society. In its mounting pressure campaign against China, the US is not only relying on CHRD for data, it is directly funding its operations. As Ben Norton and Ajit Singh previously reported for the Grey Zone, CHRD receives significant financial support from Washington's regime change arm, the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. The NGO has spent years campaigning on behalf of extreme right-wing opposition figures who celebrate colonialism and call for the, quote, westernization, end quote, of China. The second key source for claims that China has detained millions of Uyghur Muslims is Adrian Zenz. He is a senior fellow in China Studies at the Far-Right Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which was established by the US government in 1983. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is an outgrowth of the Native Captive Nations Committee, a group founded by Ukrainian nationalist Lev Dobrinansky to lobby against any effort for détente with the Soviet Union. I have to laugh when I read Victims of Communism. They should have Victims of US Empire Memorial Foundation. That would be more appropriate. Its co-chairman, Yaroslav Stetsko, was a top leader of the fascist OUNB militia that fought alongside Nazi Germany during its occupation of Ukraine in World War II. Together, the two helped found the World Anti-Communist League that was described by journalist Joe Kanasan as, quote, the organizational haven for neo-Nazis, fascists, and anti-Semitic extremists from 24 countries, end quote. That sounds like fun. Today, Dobrinansky's daughter, Paula, sits on the board of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, a former Reagan and George H.W. Bush official and signatory of the original project for a New American Century document. Paula Dobrinansky has become a fixture in neoconservative circles on Capitol Hill. From its office in Washington, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation agitates for regime change from Venezuela to the periphery of China, advancing the, quote, double genocide, end quote, theory that rewrites the history of the Holocaust and posits communism as a deadly evil on par with Hitlerian fascism. Zenz's politicized research on Xinjiang and Tibet has proven one of this right-wing group's most effective weapons. In September of 2018, Zenz wrote an article published in the Central Asian Survey journal concluding that, quote, Xinjiang's total re-education internment figure may be estimated at just over 1 million, end quote. In brackets, a condensed version of the article was initially published by the Jamestown Foundation, a neoconservative think tank founded during the height of the Cold War by Reagan administration personnel with the support of then CIA Director William J. Casey, in brackets. Like the CHRD, Zentz arrived at his estimate, quote, over 1 million, end quote, in a dubious manner. He based it on a single report by Istiqlal, excuse the pronunciation of that, TV, a Uyghur exile media organization based in Turkey, which was republished by Newsweek Japan. Far from an impartial journalistic organization, Istiqlal TV advances the separatist cause while playing host to an assortment of extremist figures. One such character who often appears on Istiqlal TV is Abdul Qadir Yapukwan, a reported leader of the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, a separatist group that aims to establish an independent homeland in Xinjiang called East Turkestan. ETIM has been designated as a terrorist organization with ties to al-Qaeda by the US, European Union, and UN Security Council, Al-Qaeda Sanction Committee. The Associated Press has reported that since, quote, 2013, thousands of Uyghurs have traveled to Syria to train with the Uyghur militant group, Turkestan Islamic Party, and fight alongside al-Qaeda, end quote, with, quote, several hundred joining the Islamic State, end quote. The Turkestan Islamic Party, TIP, has been among the most recalcitrant forces operating in the al-Qaeda-controlled Idlib province, rejecting all ceasefire efforts while indoctrinating children into militancy. TIP leadership has called on foreign Muslims to wage jihad in Syria, publishing an online recruitment video, and there's a link to that, in 2018 that celebrated the 9/11 attacks as holy retaliation against a decadent United States awash in homosexuality and sin. According to the Los Angeles Times, Yapukwan is, quote, a regular guest on Istiqlal TV, where his interviews often extended into hours-long emotional tirades against China, end quote. Turkish journalist Abdullah Bozkurt reported that Istiqlal TV has also hosted fanatical anti-Semites like Nureddin Yildiz, who is, in an interview on the network, quote, called for armed jihad not only in China's autonomous Xinjiang region but all over the world and described China as a nation of savages worse than the Jews, end quote. Well, he sounds charming. The Istiqlal TV report relied on by Zentz published an unverifiable table of, quote, re-education detainee figures, end quote, allegedly, quote, leaked, end quote, by Chinese authorities totaling 892,000 individuals in 68 Xinjiang counties as of spring 2018. Zentz pads this data by citing reports from Radio Free Asia, a US-funded news agency created by the CIA during the Cold War to propagandize against China. The Uyghur Human Rights Act, recently passed by Congress, mandates the US Agency for Global Media, the governmental parent of Radio Free Asia, to report on Xinjiang, including, quote, assessments of Chinese propaganda strategies, end quote. With this cobbling of questionable sources, Zentz extrapolates on extremely broad estimate, quote, at anywhere between several 100,000 and just over 1 million, end quote. While admitting that, quote, there is no certainty, end quote, to his estimate, he has concluded that it is nevertheless, quote, reasonable to speculate, end quote. He attempted to evade personal responsibility for the figure's questionable reliability, however, by stating, quote, the accuracy of the estimate is, of course, predicted on the supposed validity of the stated sources, end quote. As time goes on, Zentz continued to inflate his speculative estimate of Uyghur detainees, speaking at an event organized by the U.S. mission in Geneva in March 2019. Zentz stated, quote, although it is speculative, it seems appropriate to estimate that up to 1.5 million ethnic minorities have been detained by China in Xinjiang, end quote. Zenz bumped up his estimate again in November 2019 interview with Radio Free Asia, claiming China was detaining 1.8 million people. In an interview with Der Spiegel, Zenz claimed that China has effectively outlawed the practice of Islam in Xinjiang. Quote, anyone in Xinjiang who engages in any type of religious practice, anyone who even has a single Quran verse saved on their mobile phone, will be subjected to a brutal process of re-education without trial, end quote, he maintained. These incendiary claims have vaulted Zenz to the status of international quote-unquote expert on Xinjiang, earned him invites to testify before US Congress and Canadian Parliament and to deliver commentary in major US media outlets including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and Democracy Now! Zenz has also been featured by the International Consortium of, and by the way, this is very sad about Democracy Now!, they promote regime change in Syria. They've been hopeless on the whole analysis of Russiagate and kind of pretty much, I think, support the whole Russiagate thing. Now they're supporting anti-Chinese propaganda. It's just they're just getting more and more sad as time goes by. Zenz has also been featured by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, as the leading authority legitimizing their recent, quote, China cables, end quote, investigation. The ICIJ report asserts that, quote, linguists, document, and Xinjiang experts, including Zenz, who reviewed the documents, have expressed confidence in their authenticity, end quote. Given Zenz's habit of speculation and the questionable reliability of the lone Istiqlal TV media report he relies on for his estimates, it is troubling that Western governments and media have accepted and promoted his claims without a trace of skepticism. A closer look at Zenz's own biases should magnify these concerns, as he is a full-blown evangelical end-timer who appears to believe that God has sent him on a holy crusade against the People's Republic of China. A born-again Christian who claims to preach at his local church, Adrian Zenz is a lecturer at the European School of Culture and Theology. This anodyne-sounding campus is actually the German base of Columbia International University, a US-based evangelical Christian seminary, which considers the, quote, Bible to be the ultimate foundation and the final truth in every aspect of our lives, end quote, and whose mission is to, quote, educate people from a biblical worldview to impact the nations with the message of Christ, end quote. Zenz's work on China is inspired by this biblical worldview, as he recently explained in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, quote, I feel very clearly led by God to do this, end quote, he said. Quote, I can put it that way, I'm not afraid to say that. With Xinjiang, things really changed. It became like a mission or a ministry, end quote. Along with his quote-unquote mission against China, heavenly guidance has apparently prompted Zenz to denounce homosexuality, gender equality, and the banning of physical punishment against children as threats to Christianity. Zenz outlines these views in a book he co-authored in 2012 titled Worthy to Escape, Why All Believers Will Not Be Raptured Before the Tribulation. In the tome, Zenz discussed the return of Jesus Christ, the coming wrath of God, and the rise of the Antichrist. Zenz predicted that the future fall of capitalism will bring to power the Antichrist within a few decades. Oh dear. He identified the force that, quote, will usher the Antichrist into power, end quote, as, quote, the economic and financial fall of, quote, unquote, Babylon, with, quote, unquote, Babylon symbolically representing the world's global economic system, capitalism, end quote. I'll let you check out these images within this article. You can have a look at them later. Along with the fall of capitalism, Zenz also views, quote, postmodern relativism and tolerance thinking, end quote, and their apparent promotion of homosexuality, gender equality, and nonviolent parenting to be threats to Christianity and, quote, the deceptive leopard-like power behind the Antichrist, end quote. Quote, it is very likely that the global persecution of true believers will center on the charge that they promote in, quote, intolerant views, end quote, Zenz wrote, quote, especially related to preaching against homosexuality, end quote. Zenz argued that, quote, hate crime and anti-discrimination laws will likely play a major role in the suppression of biblical Christianity, end quote, and formed part of an, quote, anti-Christian tolerance campaign, end quote, because they, quote, forbid employers to discriminate based on gender and sexual orientations, end quote. Well, he's a real little Christian fascist, it would seem. Quote, the outcome of this process is open rebellion against both God and God-given human authority structures, end quote, Zen stated, decrying that, quote, rising numbers of countries are banning all forms of physical punishment of children, the primary scriptural method for instilling respect for authority in the young generation and protecting them from rebellious tendencies, end quote. Zen assures readers that, quote, true scriptural spanking is loving discipline and not violence, end quote. Quote, another important God-given authority structure that Satan is attacking through the postmodern spirit is that of gender authority structures, end quote, Zen's continued. Quote, through notions of gender equality, the enemy is undermining God's unique but different role assignments for men and women, end quote. Well, since Mary Magdalene, who, by the way, wasn't a sex worker, but Mary Magdalene was one of Jesus' top apostles, so I don't know. Anyway, given these obscurantist right-wing views, it is not surprising that Zen's proclaimed concern for the condition of Muslims in China does not seem to extend to Muslims everywhere. A search of Zen's Twitter profile returns no tweets concerning the rise of Islamophobia in the West, nor US wars and drone strikes against Muslim-majority countries. The only tweet by Zen's concerning Muslims that is unrelated to China is a denial that there is a double standard in how violence is judged when committed by white people compared to Muslims. In his December 10th, 2019 testimony to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Adrian Zenz took a victory lap of sorts for Congress passage of the Uyghur Human Rights Act the week before, which placed new sanctions on the Chinese government. Citing the bill's success, he called for opening a new front against China with a U.S. investigation into, quote, involuntary labor in relation to Xinjiang, end quote. The same day, Zantz also appeared on a panel dedicated to Xinjiang that was hosted by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center. On hand were Republican heavyweights like Sam Brownback, the ferociously anti-LGBT, anti-abortion former governor of Kansas and current U.S. ambassador at large for religious freedom, as well as top staffers of Senator Marco Rubio, the sponsor of virtually every China sanctions bill to be rubber-stamped by Congress in recent weeks. During a question-and-answer session, the Grey Zone editor Max Blumenthal asked Zantz about his fundamentalist religious views and far-right politics. Zantz did not distance himself from his past statements denouncing gender equality and, quote, tolerance thinking, end quote, or his advocacy for the, quote, scriptural spanking, end quote, of children. Instead, he asserted that there was no inconsistency between those views and the quality of his research on China's Xinjiang region. Quote, I do have a diverse background and I have personal connections which I do not believe are inconsistent with my research, end quote, Zentz responded to Blumenthal. Quote, I do not support China's authoritarian methods in any way, and I do believe there's a God who is bringing judgment in different forms. The end times is a very fascinating topic, a very complex topic, and I think very relevant, and I think it's good to live aware of that, end quote.
Adrian Zentz. Are you the author of Worthy, the same Adrian Zentz who authored Worthy to Escape, Why All Believers Will Not Be Raptured Before the Tribulation?
All right, would you mind introducing?
And that's, I mean, I just wanted to confirm that before going further. Is that correct that you authored that book?
We are asking people to introduce themselves.
My name is Max Blumenthal.
Thank you, and then we'll take the next
Well, my question, if you are the author of that book, is that you, in that book, call for spiritual spanking of children. You refer to gender equality as a satanic campaign. You speak out against hate crime and legislation and you speak out against tolerance thinking, blaming it on the leopard-like power behind the Antichrist. I was wondering how those views influence your work on China, a country that officially restricts apocalypticist evangelical religions like those expressed in that book.
Thank you for that question.
Yes, thank you for this question. I do have a diverse background and I have personal convictions, which I do not believe are inconsistent with my research. I do not support China's authoritarian methods in any way, and I do believe that there's a God who is bringing judgment in different forms. The end time is a very complex topic, a very fascinating topic, and I think very relevant. And I think it's good to live aware of that. Otherwise, I think it would be necessary to further contextualize your question, and I didn't fully understand how it was supposed to be related. Or I think you implied an inconsistency with my research on China, which I personally do not see. But thank you in any case for your question.
Moments later, a visibly upset young man rose from his seat to, quote, condemn the tanky Max Blumenthal, end quote, unleashing a torrent of insults at Blumenthal. He made no attempt to refute the journalist's line of questioning. The rigorously enforced conviction on display in the politically hermetic chambers of the US Capitol also encompasses the whole of Western media, where even purportedly progressive outlets have provided Zents with an uncritical platform. From the Washington's halls of power to major newsrooms, few are willing to let inconvenient facts get in the way of a new, undeniably faith-based Cold War crusade. That excellent reporting by Max Blumenthal and Ajit Singh, Ajit Singh is a Canada-based writer and lawyer. He tweets at Ajit Singh. You can find that on Twitter. So anyway, that's from thegrayzone.com, a wonderful independent news media outlet. The editor is Max Blumenthal. It has Ben Norton on it and Anya Paranpil, Alex Rubenstein, and a bunch of others, and it's really great. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to share with you. There's very little about China from independent media news sources, and so the more there is, the more it can address the probable propaganda that is going on, which is an attempt to vilify China further, which will, of course, lead to some justification for not only sanctions and all sorts of things, but a eventual war with China, which is sort of on the cards. Okay, so thanks for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Click the notifications bell, otherwise you won't receive updates when I drop a video. Please click the like button if you like the content, and please follow thegrayzone.com. Follow them from their website so that you receive emails from them with the latest, because Facebook and other social media, their algorithms really squash independent news. So it's best to just subscribe to their site, and then you get it directly into your inbox. So thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye for now.